oppressive heat of the Amazon rainforest clung to Dr. Sarah Thompson's skin like a second layer as she macheted her way through the dense undergrowth. Sweat trickled down her face, mixing with the smears of mud and bug repellent that had become her constant companions over the past few weeks. The 28-year-old wildlife biologist from California had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, watching nature documentaries in her parents' living room. Now, here she was, in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, on a mission to study and protect the elusive jaguar. Sarah paused to take a swig from her canteen, the lukewarm water a poor comfort against the sweltering humidity. She checked her GPS unit, confirming she was on the right track to her next camera trap location. These hidden cameras were crucial to her research, providing rare glimpses into the secret lives of the Amazon's apex predators. As she pushed through a thick curtain of vines, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a weak roar, barely audible over the constant buzz of insects and calls of distant birds, but unmistakable to her trained ear. Sarah's heart began to race, a mix of excitement and apprehension coursing through her veins. Slowly, carefully, she moved towards the source of the sound. What she saw as she emerged into a small clearing made her gasp audibly. A female jaguar, its golden coat mottled with distinctive rosette patterns, lay on the forest floor. The big cat's flanks heaved with laboured breaths, and Sarah could see why a nasty wound on its hind leg oozed blood, staining the leaf litter beneath it a dark crimson. Sarah's first instinct was to rush forward and help, but years of training and the voice of her mentor, Dr. Rodriguez, echoed in her head. Never approach an injured wild animal, especially a predator. No matter how much you want to help, remember they don't know you're trying to save them. They'll see you as a threat. She stood frozen, her mind racing. The jaguar's eyes, a mesmerizing gold green, locked onto her. In that gaze, Sarah saw a mix of ferocity and desperation that tugged at her heart. As she weighed her options, she noticed something that made the situation even more complex. The jaguar's teats were swollen with milk. "Oh no," Sarah whispered to herself. "You've got cubs, don't you?" The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Somewhere in this vast jungle, there were jaguar cubs waiting for their mother, growing hungrier and more vulnerable with each passing hour. Sarah couldn't just leave the jaguar to die, but she also couldn't risk getting mauled by trying to treat it directly. Then an idea struck her. It was risky, possibly even crazy, but it might just work. If she could find the cubs and bring them here, maybe she could buy enough time to treat the mother's wound. The jaguar would be distracted by her cubs, and maybe, just maybe, it would understand that Sarah was trying to help. Decision made, Sarah began to search the surrounding area for any sign of a den. She knew jaguars often made their dens in hollow trees or caves, so she focused on those features. Hours passed, the sun arsing across the sky and dipping towards the horizon. Sarah's muscles ached from the constant movement. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, and scratches from thorns and branches crisscrossed her arms. Just as she was about to give up hope, she spotted a small opening at the base of a massive kapok tree, partially hidden by dense foliage. Sarah's heart pounded as she approached. She pulled out her flashlight, shining it into the darkness of the cave. 2 pairs of eyes reflected the light back at her, accompanied by pitiful mewing sounds that broke Sarah's heart. The jaguar cubs, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together at the back of the den. Their spotted coats were already visible, tiny replicas of their mother's magnificent pattern. "Hey there, little guy," Sarah cooed softly, her voice catching in her throat. "Don't worry, we're going to get you back to your mum." Carefully she reached into the den. The cubs shrank back at first, but hunger and desperation soon overcame their fear. Sarah gently scooped them up, marveling at how such powerful predators could begin life as such helpless, tiny creatures. She placed them in her backpack, making sure they had enough space and air. The journey back to the injured mother jaguar seemed to take an eternity. Every cry from the cubs in her backpack made Sarah wince, imagining the mother hearing her babies but being unable to reach them. Finally, she emerged into the clearing where the female jaguar lay. The big cat's ears perked up at the sound of her cubs, and she tried to rise, only to fall back with a pained growl. Sarah's heart raced as she slowly approached, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy now, girl. I've got your babies. They're okay." See, she carefully opened her backpack, and the cubs tumbled out. They immediately rushed to their mother, mewling and squirming as they began to nurse. The jaguar began grooming her cubs, but kept one eye warily on Sarah. For her part, Sarah slowly backed away, giving the small family space. She set up a small camp nearby, close enough to observe but far enough to not be perceived as an immediate threat. Over the next few days, Sarah fell into a routine. She brought food for the mother jaguar, carefully placing meat at a safe distance. At first, the jaguar would wait until Sarah was far away before dragging the meat closer to herself and her cubs. Gradually, though, she began to accept Sarah's presence, even eating while the biologist was still in view. Sarah spent hours observing and documenting the family's behavior, filling notebook after notebook with observations and sketches. She noted how her mother, despite her injury, still managed to care for her cubs, teaching them through gentle nips and nudges. Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by the tenderness the fierce predator showed to her offspring. After a week, the jaguar's wound showed no signs of improvement. Sarah knew she had to act. She prepared a mixture of antibiotic ointment and soothing herbs, a remedy she had learned from local indigenous healers. With her heart in her throat, she slowly approached the jaguar family. The mother growled softly but didn't move as Sarah inched closer. Whether it was weakness from the wound or a growing trust, Sarah couldn't be sure. She spoke continually in a low, soothing voice as she examined the wound. It was badly infected, the flesh angry and swollen. With trembling hands and intense concentration, Sarah began to clean the wound. The jaguar growled and twitched but, remarkably, didn't lash out. Sarah worked quickly, applying the ointment and wrapping the leg with a light bandage. As soon as she finished, she backed away, breathing heavily from the tension. To her amazement, the jaguar began to lick the bandage, but didn't try to remove it. Over the next few days, Sarah repeated the treatment, each time able to get a little closer, work a little longer. The wound began to show signs of improvement, the swelling going down and healthy pink flesh replacing the infected tissue. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself becoming more and more attached to the jaguar family. She named the mother Artemis after the Greek goddess of the hunt, and the cubs Apollo and Diana. Artemis began to accept Sarah's presence more and more, even allowing her to sit nearby as the cubs played. Sarah witnessed incredible moments that few humans had ever seen. She watched as Artemis taught her cubs to stalk and pounce, using her tail as a tempting target. She saw the cubs' first clumsy attempts at climbing trees, marveling at how quickly they learned and improved. One particularly memorable evening, as the sun set and painted the forest in hues of gold and red, Sarah sat at her usual observation spot. To her shock, Apollo toddled over to her, his curiosity overcoming his caution. The cub sniffed at her boot, then looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Sarah hardly dared to breathe. Then Artemis called softly, and Apollo scampered back to his mother. But the jaguar made no move to attack Sarah or even to seem upset. In that moment, Sarah felt a connection to these wild creatures that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. As the 3rd month drew to a close, Sarah knew it was time to leave. Artemis was fully healed, and the cubs were growing rapidly. They needed to learn to survive in the wild without human interference. On her last morning in the camp, Sarah packed up her gear with a heavy heart. As she shouldered her backpack, a rustle in the undergrowth made her turn. There stood the entire jaguar family watching her. Artemis padded forward, her muscular body moving with the fluid grace that had been absent when she was injured. Sarah held her breath as the big cat approached. In an incredible moment that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life, Artemis gently rubbed her head against Sarah's hand, much like a domestic cat might do. The rough fur and the rumble of the jaguar's breath against her skin brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Then, as quickly as it had happened, Artemis turned and melted into the forest, her cubs bounding after her. Sarah stood rooted to the spot long after the jaguars had disappeared, her hand still tingling from the touch. Finally she turned and began the long hike back to civilization, her heart full of wonder and gratitude for the experience she had been granted. 3 years passed. Sarah's research on the jaguars of the Amazon had been published to wide acclaim, bringing much-needed attention to the plight of these magnificent creatures. She had thrown herself into conservation efforts, working tirelessly to protect the rainforest and its inhabitants. But always in the back of her mind, she wondered about Artemis and her cubs. When the opportunity arose to return to her old research site, Sarah jumped at the chance. As she hiked through the familiar terrain, memories flooded back. She found herself scanning the forest, hoping against hope for a glimpse of spotted fur or gleaming eyes. As she entered a small clearing, a flicker of movement caught her attention. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. From the shadows, a large jaguar emerged. For a moment, fear clutched at her had she become too complacent, too trusting. But as the jaguar moved into a shaft of sunlight, Sarah gasped. Those eyes, that distinctive pattern of spots, it was Artemis. The jaguar padded closer, and Sarah stood stock still, hardly daring to breathe. But instead of attacking, Artemis simply sat down beside her, as if greeting an old friend. Behind her, 2 younger jaguars peered out curiously from the underbrush. Apollo and Diana, now fully grown. Overwhelmed with emotion, Sarah slowly sank to the ground, sitting eye to eye with Artemis. The jaguar's gaze held the same wild power it always had, but there was also a glimmer of recognition, of shared experience. As the sun began to set, painting the Amazon sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Sarah sat with the jaguar family, marveling at the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She realized that her work wasn't just about research or even conservation, it was about fostering a connection between humans and the natural world, about recognizing the intelligence and emotional lives of the creatures we share this planet with. The deep roar of a jaguar echoed through the twilight, soon joined by others, the voices of Artemis, Apollo, and Diana blending with their wild kin. To Sarah, it sounded like a song of the Amazon itself, a reminder of the fragile, beautiful, and utterly irreplaceable web of life that we all belong to. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle through the canopy above, Sarah smiled to herself. She knew that whatever challenges lay ahead in her fight to protect the Amazon and its inhabitants, she would face them with the strength and spirit of the jaguars. And somewhere in this vast green world, Artemis and her family would be roaming free, a living testament to the power of compassion, respect, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between all living creatures.